Sponge filters. They're one of the most common things found in most freshwater aquariums when it comes to filtration. And I'm going to tell you why they suck. Hello everyone, this is Bentley, and today we're talking about these guys. Not specifically this one, but all sponge filters. This just happens to be the easiest one for me to have in my hands right now. Let me tell you why they suck. Yeah, that's right. We did a rant earlier this week about canister filters in my live stream, and now I'm going to tell you why sponge filters suck. And to give you some preface, I'm going to do this as a series. We're going to have a negative and positive video about all of your most common filter types. And we're starting with probably the most popular guy nowadays, the sponge filter. Why do sponge filters suck? They come in all sorts of different varieties. Right? You might see that as a positive. But here's the thing. Because they're powered by air, very frequently the amount of water flow and thus the amount of detritus that is actually going to flow through this sponge is significantly less than powered filtration methods. Or something like an under gravel filter, where inherently that detritus is going to sink down toward the gravel, and that consummate water flow, even though it might not be super powerful, is going to pull it deeper and deeper into the substrate to do its job. This guy requires us, and let's break it open, right? When we're using our sponge filters, the flow is effectively through here, because you're going to have an air stone down somewhere in here. Usually lower is better, but not necessarily all the way to the bottom. Some people won't even attach an air stone, and they'll just have the air line, so it's only coming here, which means that that airflow starts at the top. Now that inherently pulls water up, right? And because that air power is efficient and pulls it up, water is going to come through our porous media, the sponge. But the problem is, because that flow is not very high, if it's not suspended up in the water column, this doesn't have enough flow to pull things that would settle or just inherently get things on the far side of your tank. If you were to put this, say, on this side of the tank here, you're not going to get the stuff all the way over here. It's just not going to travel all of the way. Some of it will, but not really that much, which means you're going to need to gravel vac more often unless you have a really, really densely planted tank. And then if you have a really densely planted tank, this isn't actually doing that much work for you. Number 2, maintenance. Now I know what you're thinking. Bentley, the sponge filter is like the easiest thing to maintain. Sure, but because these are so porous, unless you have an extremely fine sponge, so something like this, like a more medium or coarse sponge, it's not going to hold everything in. When you go to maintenance, when you go to remove this, stuff is going to fall out, almost no matter how careful you are, which leads us to usually have to do some kind of bagging technique and capture stuff. But if you have things that live inside of this sponge when you want to go maintenance it, you're probably losing those things, or they're getting stuck in the bag, whatever it may be, and you might miss them. So small things like if you have scuds, you have small baby snails, you have little shrimps, maybe even certain fish fry that start very teeny tiny. These very porous areas are great nooks and crannies for those little baby things to hide, which means inherently we're going to be killing some of them every time we go to clean this dumb thing. Not that helpful if we're trying to get a really robust colony. Now you might say, oh, Bentley, nobody cares about that. Oh, you're being a big whatever, right? These are the negatives we need to consider ourselves, right? The next negative. This, even this nice green one that blends into plants well, it's still ugly. It still sticks out. It's a giant thing, and this is a smaller one. They get way bigger, right? It's still a giant thing sitting chunked in our aquarium. And for those who care about aesthetics, this is an instant no. If you're going for a nicely aquascape tank, these can be extremely difficult to hide. Now, some people can, do not get me wrong, but But often if you're trying to hide them, you're now impeding the job that this thing can do by preventing water flow from getting through there. Because in order to obscure it, you are putting things in the way that minimize the water flow and thus minimize the amount of detritus that this mechanical filtration is able to pick up. So it goes right back to one of my previous things. This can only pick up so much stuff, and realistically where it is most effective is a bare tank. No decorations, nothing. Now for you fish breeders out there, you're going to be like, what's wrong with that? It's still not optimal compared to other types of filtration. And the example I would give you is if you're a big fan of the efficiency from this and using air power, Matten filters. Compared to a Matten filter, this just ain't cutting the mustard, so to speak. This is not doing the job. Matten filters have them beat all day long. Now, we'll get into those soon, don't you worry. But let's get into my final point as to why the sponge filter sucks. Due to that limited flow we talked about earlier, and the fact that when you're using a sponge filter, you don't have some other means to hide your equipment. If you need a heater, there are certain heaters that, while more reliable or more effective or whatever it may be, don't work well with sponge filtration because it's not creating enough water movement and flow to equally distribute that heat. And my example for you would be like the Fluval E-Series heaters, and similar to this, where they pay attention to the flow rate, and if there's not enough flow, it will error, right? Because it knows it's not heating properly. This is probably the most minimal of all of the negatives to a sponge filter, but in the case where this matters, it's going to be very difficult. Another thing that kind of keys into that when it comes to the water flow and like heaters is if you're trying to do a larger tank, you need a ton of these. And you might be like, a ton? Come on, a 40 gallon, I need like 2. 75, I probably still only need 2. But if you're trying to do a larger tank, maybe you want a 125, a 140, a 240, a 180, any of your big, huge display type tanks. And this could be, you're not trying to aquascape it. You would just want to go function over form, and I totally get you. I'm with you. But that means you need a bunch of these guys, and that can be a bit of an eyesore. Or particular fish that you might have might make these a problem. Knocking them around, messing with them, whatever it may be. If you have like large cichlids and they're flinging these things around, you're now impeding and changing the flow you intended to have in your aquarium, because while these have a nice heavy base to them, if you've got big fish, they're going to move this thing. They can move this thing. Even if you're not worried about the physical appearance of it, if you set it up in a certain way, you could find out the next day when you wake up after an evening that your fish have moved it all over the place and you got to go in and re-mess with it, or you're just going to deal with like, I don't know, 3 sponge filters in the middle of your 75-gallon tank, and you're just going to go, nah, you know, they'll move it wherever they want as long as it's moving something. That's just not optimal, and you could run into some semblance of problem. And similarly, if you have a much larger tank, maybe you have a higher bioload, you might not be moving enough water to actually make this thing run at the capacity you really need to handle that larger bioload. And that is why sponge filters suck. Yeah, I know. In the comments, I want you guys to rage at me at why sponge filters are amazing, because next week, we're going to talk about why sponge filters are great. This is going to be a new little series. We're going to go through a number of different filtration types. We're going to have a little fun, the positives, the negatives, both sides. That way you get both views. And the key reason behind this, I had a rant on canister filters in regards to something similar along this topic. So I wanted to make my own videos that kind of go with like only the negative and then only the positive. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments down below. Either rage at me or just tell me, hey, I like this video concept, I can't wait to see more. Or maybe you think this is completely stupid. Also, let me know in the comments down below. But if you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing, as that's one of the best ways to help your resident dum-dum on the internet who likes to talk about fish. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome.